Today, we take an eye-opening trip to the border. Most Americans today say stricter border control is a top concern. A recent Rasmussen Report survey finds 59% of likely voters think gaining control of the border should be the top priority when it comes to immigration reform. 51% of all voters support Republican frontrunner Donald Trump's plan to build a wall along the Mexican border. We decided to head south to Arizona to see the state of the fence today. We discovered one aspect that's been overshadowed in the conversation about immigration reform: all the drugs. One look, and it's clear why securing America's southern border is such a huge challenge. Protecting Arizona's 372-mile-long boundary shared with Mexico are 1,600 federal agents, and in Cochise County, 88 deputies led by Sheriff Mark Daniels.
These rural parts, these open seams we call it, they're wide open. That should be scary to every citizen hearing this.
Daniels says one thing has gotten lost in the discussion about illegal immigration: the growing drug smuggling problem. And he has some shocking news for America.
There's been a big question here on the border: who actually controls it? Is it the federal government, or is it the cartels and transnational organizations?
Who is it?
I have to say it's a lot of cartels decide who comes across that border. And right now it's not for those looking for that better way of life. It's those actually come across to commit crimes and smuggle and victimize our citizens. I have a problem with that.
In Arizona, he says drug smuggling has never been worse, with an alarming uptick in meth, opium, and heroin.
Heroin smells like vinegar. Heroin is potent.
These drugs are making their way into Detroit. They're making their way into Los Angeles. They're making their way into New York. They're making their way into Kansas City, into the suburbs.
The real story of the border is one of unintended consequences. Sheriff Daniels says for decades, the feds have put the most effort and the biggest fences near official entry points. And that's driven the drug traffic to the less protected countryside.
They routed that illegal activity, the smuggling, the cartels, and into the rural parts with the idea that, hey, they wouldn't be able to conquer through those rural parts of the southwest border. Well, you come up to current times 20 years later, and they've conquered, they've overcome, and they rather enjoy working in the cover and concealment of the desert, the mountainous areas.
To see for ourselves, we flew by helicopter to some of the most rugged and desolate terrain along Arizona's border with Mexico. How often do you see Border Patrol while you're flying?
It's hit or miss, unfortunately. But as you can see, we'll fly quite a distance, several miles, and maybe not see any at all.
But I assume that the drug dealers know that.
Oh, you bet they know that.
We landed at one of two border ranches owned by Howard Buffett, son of multi-billionaire businessman Warren Buffett, and an unlikely soldier in the border wars.
We are probably pretty much in the heart of prime drug trafficking activity here.
You knew that when you bought it?
Oh yeah, no, I knew it when we were, yeah.
Buffett bought the ranch land in part to conserve it, but also to become a stakeholder in the border fight, which he's become deeply involved in.
Border Patrol is dealing with a topography that at times seems impossible. So I mean, you can beat up the Border Patrol on this, but the truth is, you know, it's the
Wild West.
It's the Wild West, and it's an incredibly challenging environment.
It's not hard to see why it's a trafficking hotspot. In the hours here, there was no sign of Border Patrol. We did see how easy it is to cross.
Oh yeah, see the pole off the ground, see what's been pushed down?
Flimsy wire is the only thing separating Mexican drug smugglers from the U.S.
The bottom line is that we do not have the drug traffic coming across our border under control.
The fence symbolizes America's seemingly erratic approach to border security. Near the port of entry at Douglas, Arizona, you'll find a single fence right next to a more formidable double fence and ditch.
I mean, I grew up here.
Border Patrol agent Art Del Cueto is the Tucson Sector Union president and represents agents. He's not a spokesman for Border Patrol.
This is what they want the nation to see. They want to see this fence.
A tall fence.
A tall fence, a secure fence. You know, you have agents, you have cameras, you have everything, lights throughout this area. So this is what they want the country to see, and it makes you feel secure. It makes you feel like, you know, everything's okay. But the reality is, if you go further out where they won't take you, there's still spots where there's hardly any fence.
Well, why isn't there barbed wire on the top or razor wire or something?
I mean, what we've been told and what has been explained to us is that at times if people are jumping over, it would cause issues. So that's why we don't have those type of deterrents.
So we don't have the barbed wire on top because we don't want to hurt anybody who comes across.
Correct.
From the sky, we see where the border fence is more marker than barrier and where it abruptly disappears.
If you're going to secure the border, secure the border. This is a Band-Aid right here.
Not far away on the Mexico side,
This ranch right here on the right's a stage place for their cartels.
so the gap in the fence is right by the staging place for the cartels.
Yep.
We make decisions on the type of fencing based upon the threat that we see for that area.
Commander Paul Beeson is in charge of the Border Patrol's Tucson sector.
In some areas, the threat has been from vehicles driving across. And so really, the fencing that's more appropriate there is that Normandy style fencing, because that's there to stop vehicles. If people cross there, we have time. We have the ability to interdict them. They're not going to reach a community in minutes to seconds.
Many smugglers are captured. Law enforcement recently arrested 24 members of Mexico's powerful Sinaloa cartel in an effort dubbed Operation Diablo Express. But untold numbers slip by, and surveillance video reveals the criminals' creative range. These suspected cartel members recorded themselves jacking up a section of border fence. They scurry underneath and close it like a garage door. Others easily scale the fence or just cut right through it. Some drive right over the fence using a portable ramp. This Jeep got stuck on top. The suspected smugglers ran south. And there's one more option, moving drugs under the border in secret tunnels. One of the longest and newest was discovered last year inside a shed in a Naco, Arizona neighborhood. The hydraulics operating the lid were remotely controlled from Mexico. For all of this, ranchers and residents pay a price. What's the sign up for?
The sign was posted by the U.S. Forest Service to warn people about the area, that there is criminal activity being smuggling and illegal immigration.
We live a few hundred yards from here.
Recreational activities like a family cookout in the local park are carried out with reminders of possible dangers lurking nearby. Does the discussion over drug smuggling, immigration, human trafficking impact your life at all, your daily life?
I mean, we've done a lot of service projects where we go up and clean up after the illegals that come through. You know, they leave their trash all over the place, and we go out there and try to clean up after them. But most of the time they want to stay out of the city and stay away because they don't want to be caught. They don't want to be seen. So they're trying to get north to I-10 so they can get on the highway.
Some residents live with near constant intrusions. Smugglers seeking money and guns break into the same homes over and over.
That happened in Washington, D.C. or any metropolitan area in this country, that half the homes are being broken into. I guarantee you there'd be a change.
There's a tragic impact of U.S. border policy when it comes to juvenile drug smugglers. When we return, light or no sentences for juveniles prompted cartels to recruit kids as young as 13 to transport marijuana and heroin on dangerous journeys through the desert. For Mexican drug smugglers, the U.S. border fence is more of a suggestion than barrier. Billions of tax dollars are spent trying to get ahead of the criminals who are moving incredible amounts of marijuana and heroin through Arizona and on to cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. On our trip south, some experts told us we're not even keeping up. On our trip to Arizona, multiple law enforcement officials told us it's Mexico's drug smugglers who largely control our southern border. Philanthropist Howard Buffett owns some of the most heavily trafficked border ranch land in the U.S. He says people south of the border are suffering too. An amateur photographer, he's seen the desperate and poor in Mexico and Central America, lured by the hope that a porous border gives.
First, I would say that I separate the drug activity from human activity, because the people coming across this border that are fleeing violence in the country south of here have a very legitimate concern, and their kids are getting killed, their parents are getting killed, they're getting killed. We have to be empathetic and sympathetic to that and figure out how, as a nation, do we deal with that in terms of our character and morality as a nation.
Buffett's foundation has donated an incredible amount of money, $300 million, for both humanitarian help to immigrants and for U.S. border security.
And I'd say, we can't accept what comes across this border. We just can't do it. It's as a society, it's the wrong thing to do. And that becomes a public safety issue in a very broad context. It's not just simply enforcement at the border.
Billions of tax dollars and high-tech tactics have been devoted in the past decade. There's the radar-equipped drug blimp at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center, Fort Huachuca. 4 new federal radio towers recently installed on one of Buffett's ranches.
You see increases in surveillance technology. We have integrated fixed towers, even going up even today, to increase our situational awareness. We have mobile surveillance capability that we deploy in areas that don't have the integrated fixed towers to make sure that we've got good situational awareness.
The Border Patrol's Beeson says that's how they spotted 2 of our crew vehicles during our visit.
We have agents deployed out in the rural environments. We continue to look at and shift based on the activity that we see occurring.
Back at the Cochise County Jail, a stark example of how difficult it can be to balance compassion and security. What's the youngest you've seen smuggling drugs?
13. We just had a girl that was 13.
Daniel says the feds were releasing juvenile smugglers after 30 days, so the cartels realized children would make ideal drug mules.
It's productive for the cartels and transnational organizations to grab juveniles and use them as smugglers to bring meth and heroin and marijuana, whatever they can put on their backs to bring it across. And what's really sad is they go into our high schools and recruit them. And these are vulnerable kids that look, hey, here's $3,000, go carry these drugs across the border.
Daniels and the county attorney joined to take a hard line, prosecuting smugglers as young as age 14. There are on average 25 juveniles in his jail at a given time.
Someone might say these kids are victims, just nice kids that got mixed up with the wrong people. What do you see?
And there are people that say that, but unfortunately, as I take an oath of office to enforce the laws of the land, and if somebody's smuggling, whether they're 16, 17, 15, 14, or they're 45, it doesn't matter. There's got to be consequences to those actions.
In the end, Daniels and others working the border told us they're putting out fires without an effective master plan from Washington.
After over three decades of working on this border, I can tell you this much, the will to secure this border is not there.
And those politicians that end up in those positions, they're helpful to whoever funded their campaigns, that being someone that produces cameras or someone that produces different lights. So that ensures them more business, but they need to start listening to the actual agents that are the ones putting their lives on the line, not just the people that are contributing to their campaigns.
Federal officials point to success in terms of more drugs recovered and fewer caught crossing the border.
Would you say the U.S. has solid control of its southern border?
I'd say the U.S. has significantly greater control of its border than one, many countries around the world, but two, just from the mere numbers and the information that we have, that it is much more difficult now to cross the border than it was in the past.
Gil Kurlikowski is head of Customs and Border Protection.
It wasn't that many years ago, in fact around 2000, that we had over 1.5 million people that we apprehended coming across. Last year we had below 400,000. So we have more people and more technology on the border than ever before.
Because they're more unusual.
Buffett, who's helped run some of the largest companies in the world, questions the measure of success.
You know, if I was a shareholder of a company and I had my CEO show up and tell me year after year, well, we did better this year, we just lost less money. And that's the kind of metrics Border Patrol uses. When the metrics are, well, we captured less people, we apprehended less people, or, you know, we got a little bit more drugs, that can be for a whole host of reasons. You know, there could be less people crossing, they could be doing a better job of it, Border Patrol could have prioritized resources in a different location, and I'm always careful when I make that criticism because I don't have a really good answer to that. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I do think part of the answer is our government admitting that we're failing at this. We're not doing the job we need to do.
We'll have more reporting from the border here on Full Measure in the coming weeks. On our recent trip to the southern border, we saw how easily drug smugglers climb over or cut through the border fence, or simply find spots where there's no fence at all. But you might be surprised to know how extensively Mexico smugglers use another tactic to move people and drugs into the U.S., underground tunnels. Earlier this month, a tunnel the length of 4 football fields was discovered running from a restaurant in Mexico to a house in Southern California. And that's how we begin this week with tunnel vision. It's nicknamed the James Bond Tunnel, the first known drug tunnel unearthed in the U.S. back in 1990. Federal agents who found it said it was like something out of a Bond movie. At 270 feet long, it was dug near the official border crossing in the town of Douglas, Arizona, part of a drug trafficking network run by Mexican cartel kingpin El Chapo Guzman. In just 7 months, the feds say Guzman used this 5-foot-tall underground passageway to help smuggle 60,000 pounds of cocaine into the U.S. On the Mexican side, there was a hidden switch inside a smuggler's luxury home used to lift a pool table and concrete slab to open the passageway.
It was a dangerous job.
Border Patrol agent Sergio Martinez.
The first tunnel was discovered in 1990 in Douglas, Arizona, and since then they have encountered 183 tunnels within the Tucson sector and in the southern border. Most recently is in Nogales, Arizona, and they have actually created a team. It's called the Nogales Tunnel Team in Nogales, where their daily duties are to go find tunnels.
Border Patrol agents use remote-controlled robots to investigate the tunnels. The majority of them, at least 100, have turned up in the town of Nogales, Arizona, some just steps from the border crossing teeming with federal agents. This tunnel on the border town of Naco is one of the longest at more than 900 feet and one of the most recent discoveries. Here in southern Arizona, we're just a few hundred yards from the Mexican border. That's it, the fence over there. And you can see right here in what looks like a shed next to a house, that's where the drug tunnel is.
So apparently they were coming in through the shed, parking over here, opening the door, loading up their vehicle, and then pulling the stuff out of the tunnel.
And tell us how it was discovered.
It was discovered by human intelligence. They pulled a vehicle over, and the guy had over 4,000 pounds of contraband in his vehicle, and ended up giving some information up, and they came to the house with a warrant and arrested the other individual living in the house. And here we come in here. Here's the actual tunnel. So they had a lift gate. They were bringing the narco traffics and all the stuff they have, all the narcotics, they were bringing them up. They had a lift. Since they're so heavy, they were just bringing it up straight up.
How long was an operation like this going on for them to be able to dig the tunnel and move the drugs? And
that is unknown, but we believe they probably had it for quite a while. As you can see, it's a very sophisticated tunnel with these poles under. There were lights. They were using oxygen to go across the border.
Yeah, there was a little...
Cochise County Sheriff Mark Daniels says the illegal enterprise operated for months in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
And they had a guard that watched it on this side who was armed when they took him down. But it's a VIP tunnel. It's very sophisticated down there.
What do you mean VIP tunnel?
Very important tunnel. The normal person coming across the border to find that better way of life wasn't coming through here. This was your high quality drugs were coming through here, heroin, methamphetamine, and you hate to think, but I think there's a reality touch to it. Whoever could pay a fee, and possibly terrorists coming through here, which scares the heck out of me, and should scare everybody when it comes to this tunnel. The opening of this tunnel was only controlled on the Mexico side. The U.S., the folks guarding the tunnel on this side had no control on opening or closing it.
You mean it was mechanically shut, sealed, and opened?
Yeah.
But from Mexico?
From Mexico, correct. The effort and the work and the expense to build a tunnel of this magnitude, it shows you how desperate they are to get their product through.
So they're literally digging under where Border Patrol and you guys may be walking above ground every day.
You know what's disappointing is we promote community policing, both the Border Patrol and us, when it comes to getting in our communities, working, gathering that intel, but nobody reported this.
We have trained agents, and we have become more able to discover and use technology to find them. It has decreased the use of them. So we have found, I believe, 3 in the last year, and 7 and 6 and 5 through the years previous to that. So we're getting better at it.
Last year, El Chapo Guzman, the father of all drug tunnels, escaped from a maximum security Mexican prison through what else but an elaborate tunnel almost a mile long. Prison surveillance video shows him making a quick exit. The tunnel was complete with lights, ventilation, and a motorcycle on rails that was likely used to carry out dirt. Guzman was recaptured in January. U.S. officials have noted a similarity between the tunnel Guzman used to escape and that very first one discovered in Douglas, Arizona, back in 1990. They may want to check the floor of his prison cell daily. Tuesday's primary day in 3 states, including Arizona, where immigration is a big issue, as it is everywhere in this presidential campaign. There's another harsh reality on the border that you may be surprised to hear exists in America. U.S. border towns so influenced by the influx of illegal smugglers and drugs, it's worked its way into the fabric of daily life. To see for ourselves, we visited Douglas, Arizona, a town of about 17,000. It's just across the border from the Mexican town of Agua Prieta, a famous battle site of the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s. Our guide is a Douglas native and Border Patrol agent who views the town's challenges as a testament to the larger border problems facing the U.S.
It's just well known, it's just well known who's involved in drugs. It's well known on both sides.
For U.S. Border Patrol agent Art Del Cueto, the dusty drive south to his hometown of Douglas, Arizona, is a twisted trip down memory lane.
This is 10th Street. I grew up here. I remember driving through these streets all the time.
At the Douglas port of entry,
as a kid, we used to go into Mexico all the time.
He still finds a familiar face.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it.
$1 billion in legal trade passes through this port each year. And then there's the illegal trade. Unknown amounts of marijuana, opium, and heroin are smuggled in vehicles or across the fence. On the other side of the fence is the Mexican city Agua Prieta.
In this area on the south end, it's basically the Sinaloa cartel that runs this whole operations down there.
It's a well-known drug smuggling corridor controlled by the most powerful drug trafficking organization on the planet.
Look at this house. If I had that much money where I could afford that house, I think Agua Prieta in front of the border would be the last place I would have built that house.
It's become a constant theme in Douglas and other U.S. border towns. The corrupting influence of Mexico's drug cartels has worked its way into the community in ways that many Americans would find shocking, but local residents take for granted.
Unfortunately, living and growing up here, it's easier to take the bad road. It's less taboo to do the bad thing than it is to take the high road, and that it is to do the right thing.
Growing up, drugs were plentiful and often free for the asking.
When I was in 6th grade, it was the very, very first time that I saw heroin, and that first time that I saw an individual using heroin, and it was another kid in junior high.
The D on the hill stands for Douglas. It's used as a navigation marker by smugglers. Have you ever wondered what this town would be like if it weren't for the drug trade?
3/4 of the town wouldn't be here. A lot of Douglas exists because of the drug trade.
Come to a town like this in Arizona and ask about drug cartels, and it's not a bad idea to have extra security. We did. Fear of retaliation from the drug cartel interests is why this local resident asked not to be identified. He told us he was approached by drug traffickers operating in Douglas.
They just walked in. It was closing time, and they took out a large amount of cash and told me this is how it's going to work. You don't know if you're going to be assaulted, maybe a gun was going to pull out. I just didn't know what to do.
And so how did you get out of that situation?
I just took my stand. I told them that from day one, my parents always told me, you're never going to dirty your name. Work hard for your money. It's better to have no money than dirty money.
He believes that rejection of the drug traffickers is why his business rent was tripled, forcing him to close down. Daniel Nunez also resists pressure and temptation. He comes from Agua Prieta each day, where he lives and takes classes, to work legally in this Douglas coffee house.
Do you walk over?
Yeah.
You must have friends or people you know who've gotten mixed up in crime and bad things.
Yeah, actually, I have a lot of friends in Mexico that they cross drugs. They're telling me, hey, do you want to smoke? Do you want drugs? Something that I don't do. I don't want that for me. I want to, like say, I want to grow up, be a good person, have my work, have a job.
Before the drugs, Douglas was the smelter city, a booming western copper smelting town, a stone's throw from the rich discoveries of gold, silver, and copper in the 1880s. The Grand Gadsden Hotel stands as a reminder of Douglas's heyday. Legend has it that Mexico's Revolutionary General Pancho Villa rode his horse up this staircase and chipped the 7th stair from the bottom, right there. But the smelter shut down in 1987. 347 jobs and $27 million a year evaporated from the local economy. Mexico's emerging drug trade was there to fill the void. Robert Uribe envisions a different future for Douglas. He's an artist from the Dominican Republic who owns the coffee shop.
Douglas has all the elements laid out to be successful again. I think that we're in a process of finding that identity.
Uribe settled here after marrying a local.
Anytime.
They hope to help convert the town into a tourist center and art colony.
I'm very excited to be able to present Douglas a new idea, a new vision.
And no one has approached you and tried to ask you to launder money or be part of this?
I've yet to experience that. So that to me shows me that people respect what we do. So I hope that they don't approach me with any of those suggestions of wanting to do anything that's illegal, because that's not what we do.
So if I apprehend him here, it's just easier.
Del Cueto would also like to see a different future for his hometown, but says it's a monumental fight given the current state of the border.
Tucson sector is still responsible for over 50% of all the drugs that are coming into the country. That's humongous. That's a huge, huge amount. You see people further into the country that say, it can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. It is that bad.
I remember running around this block and...
Today, he can't help but engage in an old pastime, pointing out people living lifestyles that he says are far beyond what their legitimate salaries would allow.
It's the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. People try to turn a blind eye.
And that realization is the key to how and why Del Cueto says he got out of Douglas and sought a career as a Border Patrol agent, fighting the very cartels that have long corrupted his home.
Douglas is a town that what?
Douglas is a town that doesn't forget. That's what I would say. It's a town that has taught me a lot of lessons. It teaches a lot of people a lot of lessons, and you have to know how to take those lessons and learn from them.
We learned a lot about the influence and the method of the drug trade on the Arizona border. In the weeks ahead on Full Measure, we'll take you into the tunnels that are the high-volume highways for smuggling drugs into the United States. The number and the degree of sophistication are incredible. One border agent called them scary. Securing the southern border is a top priority for President-elect Donald Trump. Just how big and what form the promised wall will take remains to be seen. Already, there's an army of federal agents guarding the line between the U.S. and Mexico. Their top priority, keeping terrorists and their weapons out. Today, we explore the risk of border agents getting corrupted and crossing the line to the dark side. Customs and Border Protection is the largest federal law enforcement organization in the U.S. 60,000 employees secure more than 100,000 miles of borders and coastline. But to criminal drug cartels, all that security looks a lot like opportunity.
We have a number of adversaries south of the border, whether it's Mexican drug trafficking cartels as well as alien smuggling organizations who actively seek to corrupt U.S. government employees to facilitate their criminal enterprises.
Supervisory Special Agent Jeff Veltri is briefing us at the FBI's Border Corruption Task Force in San Diego, California. What tactics do they use?
They spot and assess individuals who would flirt with women who come through their lanes or potentially have financial distress in their lives, gambling debts, and then they target those vulnerabilities.
Individuals like Michael Taylor, an immigration officer at the largest land port of entry in the world, San Ysidro, California. That's where a cartel-connected Mexican beauty salon worker came through Officer Taylor's lane and caught his eye.
Ultimately, they exchanged telephone numbers. He began dating. She indicated to him at one point that she wanted to cross a friend or a relative.
An illegal immigrant.
An illegal immigrant. And she gave him $500 in exchange. From that, what we would call in law enforcement, he got a taste, and that was the beginning of his corrupt activities.
Officer Taylor smuggled people and drugs for 3 years before getting caught. But there was another target of the crosshairs of the Mexican beauty salon Matahari.
She ended up corrupting yet another Customs and Border Protection officer, and that would be Mr. Warren Hammer Jones.
In a decade-long crime spree, Officer Jones helped smuggle in people and 33 tons of marijuana. One reason the dark side is so tempting is because the payoff is so big. Border agents and officers make $38,000 to $69,000 a year. What kind of money can the illegal activity bring in for a corrupt agent?
They could, in theory, make more in an evening than their annual salary would garner.
The FBI now has 22 border corruption task forces dedicated solely to rooting out dirty officers on the take. They caught Officer Michael Gilliland on surveillance video, allegedly carrying a cash payoff in a bag. He pled guilty to letting in hundreds of illegal immigrants for $120,000 in bribes. And there are many more. Agent Marcos Manzano Jr. hid illegal immigrants in his family's house. Agent Michael Gonzalez is seen here on a police camera loading pot into his vehicle. Officer Margarita Crispin is serving 20 years for taking bribes to let marijuana through, and Officer Martha Garnica is serving 20 years for smuggling. Her lavish home and suspicious behavior raised red flags among colleagues.
All of these individuals take an oath to protect this country against enemies foreign and domestic, and they are violating that oath, and they are violating the trust of the American people.
From 2004 to 2014, 168 Customs and Border Protection employees were arrested, indicted, or prosecuted on corruption charges. Jim Tomczyk believes the actual number of crooked agents is much higher. How rampant do you think potential corruption is inside Customs and Border Protection?
I think it's possible that 1,500 to 2,000 of them have either historically been involved with corruption or may today be actively involved with corruption.
Tomczyk led the fight to expose unscrupulous officers at Customs and Border Protection as Chief of Internal Affairs. Were you surprised at how much corruption you saw in that position?
Yes.
Part of that, he says, was due to a major recruiting effort that rushed to hire 6,000 new Border Patrol agents over 2 years.
That hiring initiative that occurred between 2006 and 2008 created opportunities for persons to infiltrate the agency.
Only after all that hiring did Customs and Border Protection, CBP, begin giving lie detector tests to applicants. The results were eye-opening.
Most shocking was the discovery that there were persons in the applicant pool who had been directed to apply for positions who actually worked for drug trafficking organizations, either on the U.S. side or the Mexican side of the border.
They admitted this in the polygraph test?
Yes.
Can we assume that before the polygraphs were instituted, people like that may have slipped under the radar and gotten hired?
Let there be no doubt that is exactly the case.
But Tomczyk says his anti-corruption efforts were stymied by then head of Border Patrol, David Aguilar.
I was very surprised to hear his response, which was one of anger, not one of appreciation. He was yelling when he said, "This is not what we do. We manage this problem."
What do you think he meant by "we manage it"?
They attempted to manage the problem by hiding the problem and dealing with it within the ranks of the Border Patrol.
Later, in a whistleblower complaint, Tomczyk alleged the Border Patrol's Aguilar called him and his deputy James Wong into a meeting and gave them a strange order to redefine corruption.
What we were told to do was to redefine corruption in a way that would reduce the actual number of corruption arrests from what was at that point 80-something to a number that was less than 30. Mr. Aguilar actually took a sheet of paper and wrote a number on it that was 20-something and kept tapping it with his pen as he was explaining how we would go about redefining corruption in a way to reduce the number of corruption arrests.
How would one do that, redefine corruption?
It couldn't be done, and more importantly, we wouldn't consider doing it. Mr. Wong and I clearly understood that we were being given an order to cook the books. When we returned to our offices and looked at one another, we both had the same reaction, that we had been in a bad scene in a very bad movie.
Tomczyk says when he wouldn't go along, he got socked with lower job performance scores. He filed a whistleblower retaliation complaint and was eventually moved out of his job.
What do you think was the reason you were removed?
The aggressive posture that I and my colleagues had taken with regard to corruption, misconduct, and excessive use of force.
Aguilar, the Border Patrol manager Tomczyk accused, declined our interview request and has since retired. The Border Patrol had no comment. The vast majority of the men and women who work the border are honest, but the impact of even a few bad apples could be devastating. They could allow in terrorists. In November of last year, days after terrorist attacks overseas, 8 Syrians were caught illegally crossing into the U.S. from Mexico. So were 5 Pakistanis and a man from Afghanistan with alleged terrorist ties. Over several years, Border Patrol caught nearly 2,000 illegal immigrants from 35 countries designated as states that could harm the U.S. with terrorism.
The biggest concern would be somebody with nefarious intentions to harm our nation finding themselves in that pipeline.
Gil Kurlikowski is the current Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection.
There is a lot of concern among law enforcement. They know that most people who cross the border will not be terrorists, but they don't even want one to slip through, and they feel like it's hard to get a grip on all that.
Well, I think the terrorism issues, particularly after the attacks in Paris, the continuing war in Syria and the number of people, millions of people that have been displaced. Compared to what's going on in Europe, our issues are significantly fewer or less than that. But is there the potential then for somebody to enter the country or try to enter the country? That's always a concern to us, and we have to be aware of it.
That point is punctuated by Customs and Border Protection Officer Luis Alarid. In this surveillance video, Alarid waves through a white minivan carrying 18 illegal aliens. His cut for that one load, $36,000, close to his annual salary. A search of his home turned up $175,000 in cash. In an alarming taped confession, Alarid admits helping smuggle in 100 unknown people.
And nobody that I know of that's been Laden. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
I think his comment speaks to his woeful indifference.
Do you feel confident that we are, in part because of the FBI's efforts, about as safe as we can be in trying to minimize that threat of a terrorist coming through?
I feel as confident as I'm gonna feel about it. You're never gonna stop anyone who is morally bankrupt and has a price for their integrity. If you're for sale, then the question is what your price is.
Tomczyk, the whistleblower, retired last year. Customs and Border Protection reversed his negative review and in April settled his whistleblower case. The agency has now begun polygraphing all new Customs and Border Patrol applicants, but it's not a good sign that the majority are flunking the lie detector tests. Today, President Obama arrives in Havana, Cuba. He's the first sitting president to visit the island nation since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. Most Americans might be surprised to know that while the president is headed to Cuba, an astonishing number of Cubans are surging into the U.S. They're taking advantage of a law that allows them to stay legally in the U.S. if they can get 1 foot on American soil. That law is a relic from the Cold War and one that some want to change.
Congressman Henry Cuellar is a Democrat from the border town of Laredo, Texas.
which has seen an incredible surge in Cubans crossing the Mexican border into the U.S.
And when you actually see the numbers, it is literally mind-boggling.
After several years of averaging only about 7,000 a year, the flood of Cubans began, reaching 24,000 in 2014, 43,000 in 2015, and another 25,000 in the past 5 months, meaning this year could top the others. Most of them come in through Cuellar's district in Laredo.
47,000 have come in through just the port of Laredo.
It's by far the biggest flood of Cubans to the U.S. since the Mario boat lift in 1980, a mass exodus after Cuba's Castro government announced anyone who wanted to would be allowed to leave. 125,000 came to the U.S., many on flimsy rafts. The law was amended in 1995. Now Cuban citizens intercepted at sea are turned back. But if they can manage to get 1 foot on U.S. soil, they're allowed to stay. It's called wet foot, dry foot. Can you explain what the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy is for the United States?
Basically says that if somebody from Cuba touches land in the U.S., they get to stay here. They don't have to show that there's credible fear or they're asylum or a refugee.
Cuellar, whose father was born in Mexico, says he's pro-legal immigration, but insists U.S. law gives Cubans an unfair advantage.
I can understand if somebody comes in and makes their case and says, credible fear, refugee, asylum, you make your case in front of an immigration judge. But what other country gets a blanket, just get to the U.S. and you're in? Nobody else gets that.
The new surge happened as word got out that President Obama would be changing the U.S. relationship with Cuba.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
If our relationship with Cuba is warming, why so many people in the last 2 years flooding across our border trying to come here?
Basically, they think that this new relationship with the U.S. means that Congress is going to change the Cuban Adjustment Act, which means that they're going to take that away. So they want to come in and take advantage of this law while it still exists.
Would you go so far as to say the administration was keeping this secret? Surely they knew about these massive influxes.
Without a doubt. They knew about it, no ifs, no buts. Why they were not providing that information, why they were not even providing that information to members of Congress that represent those areas is, without due respect to the administration, I don't think that was the right thing to do.
Cubans have been streaming into Laredo almost every day. They look for the Cuban flag a few steps from the entry gate into the U.S. and know that the man inside the modest office will help. Alejandro Ruiz came to the U.S. from Cuba in 1992 and has found a calling sheltering new arrivals like Sariha Casas. She, her husband, and 9-year-old son have been living with Alejandro for the last month.
If it weren't for Alejandro and Dania, which is the other girl, we would still be in that stairwell from the day we arrived.
Belkis Mora Suarez is a doctor. She arrived this week, happy to leave Cuba behind.
I have opportunities. I'm a doctor. I have opportunities to get my children out of Cuba because there they don't have a life. They don't have a future.
She come with the baby.
Ruiz gets them Social Security cards and helps them fill out paperwork that immediately qualifies them for federal benefits, including food stamps and a cash payment starting at $445 a month for 9 months. After 1 year, they get permanent legal residency.
I love my country. I love my people. I never come back to Cuba. That's what I do this for them because they need it. They need this type of support.
The route to Laredo has been roundabout. Very few Cubans are allowed to fly directly to the U.S., so they've flown to Ecuador, made their way to Costa Rica, paid $555 to board chartered flights to Mexico, then walked across the U.S. border into Texas. Last month, Cuellar visited a camp of Cuban migrants on the journey in Costa Rica.
Do you understand that in my area, you have unaccompanied kids who are fleeing very dangerous areas like Honduras and other places because of the drug violence and the highest murder rates in the world, and they're trying to flee that violence, and you're coming in more because you want to have political freedom, you want to, another system besides Castro. The person looked at me, he smiled, he says, I understand, Congressman, but as long as we have this Cuban Adjustment Act, we're going to take advantage of that.
Cuellar has authored a bill to end the Cuban Adjustment Act, but isn't optimistic about its chances in a presidential election year. The White House didn't respond to a request for comment, but Obama spokesman Josh Earnest said in January there are no plans to change the policy. Costa Rica and other countries are already beginning to clamp down on their visa policies.